Hopefully that's good. All right. Still waiting on Tyler. Hopefully Tyler shows up in just a minute. Just got spring break. Good? Go anywhere? No? Not fun? What's up, Tyler? All right. Well, here we are, Wednesday, April 7th. We are coming down to the wire here. We got to get through quite a bit before we take the AP exam in just over a month. But we're going to just continue plugging right along, and today our focus is on Russia, but then also we'll be talking a bit about imperialism and stuff like that. So I mentioned a few weeks ago, one of the easiest ways to remember the different Tsars of Russia, the leaders of Russia, is this little acronym ANAN, A-N-A-A-N, which basically stands for Alex the First, Nicholas the First, Alex the Second, Alex the Third, Nicholas the Second. Those are the last 5 Tsars of Russia, ANAN. Okay, A-N-A-A-N. And one of the things that you have to keep in mind about Russia is because Russia is essentially one of the last places in Europe to begin industrializing, they remain essentially a century behind the rest of Europe. Okay, so even though we're in the late 1800s, Britain, Germany, France, all of them have begun adopting more democratic institutions, right? This whole period of time that we're talking about here of the 19th century, particularly this last part of the 19th century where we're talking about the age of mass politics, where more and more people are becoming involved in government. The government is passing laws that affect the masses, if you will. Russia is essentially doing none of that. Okay, Russia is the exception to what is going on in Europe for the most part at this time. They remain strictly absolutist in nature, very autocratic, all right, meaning that the Tsar has total absolute authority, runs the government in a way in which there is very little freedom, and it's essentially very much like a dictatorship, if you will, okay? What we are going to see in Russia is increased hostility from the people of Russia who become very disenchanted with the government, okay, which is very autocratic. So let's just talk about what happens in Russia here. Whoops. Did I mess that up? Okay, Russia, here we go. So, bringing you back to the last time that, well, not maybe the last time that we talked about Russia, but one of the things that we talked about with Russia was something called the Crimean War, all right? The Crimean War happens in 1853, and it lasts until 1856. And this short conflict was Russia basically making a fuss about the fact that France had been granted some rights in the Holy Land, and Russia didn't like that, and so they waged war to try to defend Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the Holy Land, all right? If you'll recall, during the Crimean War, Russia lost that war, all right? Russia lost the Crimean War. And that really marked a turning point in Russian history, because that's the thing that started to get them on the path towards becoming more modern, all right? It became very clear after the Crimean War that Russia was falling behind the rest of Europe in terms of industrialization and production and stuff like that, all right? And so the problem, though, is that unlike in Britain, unlike in France, unlike in Germany, which are relatively small places where the people are able to develop a pretty strong national spirit, you also had more wealth in those nations, so you had a more thriving middle class, that group of people who aren't really peasants, they're not nobles, but they're kind of in between. They had a thriving middle class in France, in Britain, in Germany. They don't have one in Russia, all right? Russia lacks that sizable middle class that had for years in Western Europe been promoting things like liberalism. And when I say liberalism, I'm talking about laissez-faire economics, right? Hands off, the government keeps its hands off the economy, free trade, those kinds of things. Also political liberalism, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of these kinds of ideas that got promoted during the Enlightenment. These ideas don't really spread to Russia, all right? As a result of that, Russia's going to have a hard time catching up to where the rest of Western Europe is, all right? Russia realized it had to modernize, or it's going to remain vulnerable both economically and militarily. So, Tsar Alexander II is the guy that comes in. You might remember one of the things I told you about the Crimean War. The guy that waged the Crimean War was Nicholas I, okay? Nicholas I. But he dies in 1855. When Nicholas I dies, he is succeeded by Alexander II. When Alexander II comes to power, he doesn't have the same interest in continuing to wage the Crimean War that Nicholas I did. So Alexander II ends the war, and Russia ends up losing the war. But really, Tsar Alexander II was probably the greatest Tsar that Russia had, going all the way back to Catherine the Great in the 1700s. He believed that serfdom had retarded Russia's modernization, in other words, slowed it down, okay? Agriculture had been poor for centuries in Russia. It was behind. They didn't produce as much as other places, despite the fact that Russia had huge amounts of land. They weren't able to keep up with the agricultural production that places like Britain and so on did because of industrialization advancements and stuff. In 1861, Alexander II passed something called the Emancipation Act, which ended serfdom, because he thought that that was going to be a key point of Russia modernizing. And so he abolished the serfdom. Peasants were no longer dependent on their noble lords of the lands that they lived on. They were free to move about and change their occupations. They could enter into private contracts and even own property and things like that. And most Russians were not really impacted by this emancipation because they lived in these little things called mirs. Mirs are these communities that were essentially top-down, very heavily regulated, and it was just because you pass a law about something doesn't mean that immediately everybody's going to follow that law, okay? Take, for example, here in America, all right, back in the 1920s, they passed something called the Volstead Act, which was prohibition on alcohol, all right? Just because they passed that doesn't magically mean that everybody is just going to stop producing, consuming, marketing alcohol, all right? So what ended up happening during these years where prohibition was in effect and people couldn't buy alcohol is that it immediately made it an illegal business, but people still kept doing it, all right? Point being that just because you emancipate the serfs on a broad scale, practically, all right, in terms of what actually ends up happening, just because you pass this law or this edict, doesn't mean that people are necessarily going to follow it. So many of these Russians, these serfs, peasants that were living in these mirs, which were highly regulated farming communities essentially, their everyday life doesn't change a whole lot in the short term. So they lived in these highly regulated communes, and you had collective ownership and responsibility amongst all these peasants that were living there. They were expected to do certain things, produce a certain amount, et cetera, and it made it really difficult for these individual peasants or serfs to improve agricultural methods or leave these villages. They already don't have much. It's kind of like, think about here in the United States too, just to give you another comparison, maybe a closer comparison, the ending of slavery after the Civil War. In practical terms, the ending of slavery after the Civil War really didn't help the African American community in the South very much because the law changed. They're no longer slaves, but you think about it this way, this community of slaves that's now free, okay, in America, they couldn't read, they couldn't write, they had no money, and they had been living for generations and generations on these plantations. Plantation farming was the only thing that they knew how to do. And so as a result of that, we see other institutions after slavery ends, like sharecropping or tenant farming, that essentially just end up replacing slavery and keeping African Americans in the South very subjugated as a community. And that's largely because essentially the Reconstruction era after the Civil War fails. All right, it doesn't do enough to help African American freed slaves in the South obtain autonomy and independence. And so, similar kind of thing here in Russia. Just because you free the serfs doesn't mean that immediately all of them are going to go out and start buying Lamborghinis, and you know what I'm saying? I'm exaggerating, but it's not going to change their everyday lives that much. You also had these communities called zemstvos. Zemstvos were established in 1864. These were essentially local assemblies, almost like a city council, if you will, okay, that administered these local areas. And these zemstvos were a significant step towards popular participation in government, because now you have kind of these councils that meet, these assemblies that meet in local areas where the community is able to come in and have a voice in what goes on locally, all right? So you have these little zemstvos that are popping up all over these agricultural communities in the Russian countryside. But the fact of the matter is that the lords of the land, the nobles of Russia, controlled those zemstvos, and they had more power in the zemstvos than the peasant villagers did. So again, pragmatically, even though you are taking a step forward in having the peasants and serfs have a say in what goes on locally, nonetheless, the nobles still remain very much at the top of the social hierarchy. You do have some other reforms that happened under Alexander II. Tsar Alexander II was rather progressive-minded. He wanted to modernize Russia, catch Russia up to Western Europe, and the judicial system is improved. They relax censorship. Remember that censorship is any time where the government comes in and says you can't publish that, you can't print that, you can't say that. They do relax it. They don't get rid of it completely, but they relax censorship. And the education systems, particularly the upper education systems, are somewhat liberalized in Russia under Alexander II. Also, during Alexander II's reign, industrialization. For the first time, Russia is really starting to industrialize. And they begin, thanks to foreign investment from Germany, from France, they start to construct railroads. In particular, Russia is huge. You guys know what Russia looks like on a map. It's enormous, right? If you're looking and comparing, let's say, Russia with Britain, Britain's a tiny little island, right? Russia's this giant continental landmass that literally spans 2 continents, Europe and Asia, all right? It's going to be a lot easier to build railroads around Britain because you don't have to build as many of them. You can connect all sorts of places together in railroads relatively quickly. In Russia, to build a single railroad across the entire Russian continent is going to take a long time. And that railroad that they build from Western Russia all the way over to Eastern Russia, where the Pacific is, it's called the Trans-Siberian Railway, okay, the Trans-Siberian Railway. And it starts being constructed right around this time, 1860s. And Russia, again, had fallen behind major industrialized nations. From 1860 to 1880, look at this, railroad mileage grew from only 1,250 miles of railroad to 15,500 miles of railroad. Why are railroads so important? You guys know probably the answer to this. We've talked about industrialization. What do railroads do? What do they help you do? Transport goods, right? Exactly. Okay? You can load up coal, food, you name it, onto railroads and transport things much more quickly and efficiently. So railroads were a real key point of Russian industrialization. They enabled Russia to export grain and then earn profits for more industrialization. And it also strengthened their military. All right, it gave them, it helped them rise to expanding their territory both to the south and to the east. There are, though, various conservative critics who don't like the more modern progressive policies that Tsar Alexander II is putting in. So some of these more traditional conservative nobles who disagree with Alexander II start to be critical of his rule. And you had this radical populist movement that emerged that sought to create a utopian agrarian order, borderline kind of borderline communism in a way, but that doesn't proliferate until later. And railroads, of course, as I said, enabled them to expand their profits and stuff like that. Nihilism. Nihilism is a philosophical school of thought, I guess. And nihilism was made most popular by a guy, you may have heard of his name before. Anyone ever heard of a guy named Friedrich Nietzsche? Friedrich Nietzsche, or Nietzsche, okay? If you've never heard of him, he is a philosopher from Germany, okay? Friedrich Nietzsche is from Germany. But he's the one who really popularized nihilism as a political school of thought. Nonetheless, this school of thought is expanding to intellectuals across Europe at this time, including even intellectuals in Russia. And nihilism is intellectuals who believed in nothing but science, and that the current social order of serfs, peasants, or even middle-class bourgeoisie types of people, that all of those classes should be eliminated and built up from scratch. So the nihilists, if you think about the word annihilate, okay? You guys know what that word annihilate means? What do you do when you annihilate something? No idea? Annihilation is like you completely blow it up, right? Completely blow everything up. So when we think about nihilism, think about it as blowing up the current social order and building it from the ground up again, all right? All right, Alexander II, due to some of his radical policies, ends up getting assassinated in Russia in 1881 by radicals, anarchists most likely, who bombed his carriage in St. Petersburg. You can actually go and visit the very same spot that Alexander II was assassinated at in St. Petersburg today. One of the major contributors to Russian industrialization was this guy. His name was Count S.Y. Witte. He was German, and he oversaw Russian industrialization in the late 1800s, 1890s, and aggressively courted Western capital. In other words, S.Y. Witte, he's this noble German guy. He's trying to get foreign nations from Western Europe, Britain, France, various other places, to invest money in developing Russia. So he aggressively is trying to court or gain favor with Western nations for the purposes of gaining capital, money, and advancing technology to build factories in Russia. And thanks to S.Y. Witte, you have what we see in the late 1800s in Russia is a small Russian middle class emerge. And this small middle class is going to be the key to Russia continuing to industrialize, because remember, industrialization rests on three things: the factors of production: land, labor, capital. Capital meaning money that has to be invested into businesses through things like we talked about when we learned about the Industrial Revolution, like entrepreneurship and stuff like that. Business investments, taking risks on businesses, investing money in them, and having them thrive. All right, the government began building state-owned railroads, which doubled to 35,000 by the year 1900. So they went from 1,250 miles of railroad in 1860 to, by the time that we get to 1900, they now have 35,000 miles worth of railroad tracks. That's a whole lot, okay? 35,000 miles worth of railroads. During this time, Russia adopted what was known as the gold standard. The gold standard was, at the time, thought of as a way to stabilize currency. These days, okay, do I have any money? Let's see if I have any money. Okay, look at this. For the first time ever, I have cash. This, excuse me, this, folks, is the extent of my savings account. All right, $1. Just a little bit of a joke there, not much of one though. Okay, so $1. When you go to the store and you lay down $1 on the table and you slide it over to pay for something, why does the person on the other side of the counter take it? You guys know? Any idea? Because you owe it. Partly, because you're probably paying for somebody. You're not just giving dollars away to people, right? Sure, okay. But why will they specifically take this? I mean, you could put, what if I put down, whatever, 100 pesos on the counter? Why won't they take that? It's the national currency here, right? What are they going to do with this dollar? When you pay somebody $1, what are they going to do with it? Yeah. Later on, what are they going to do with it? Yeah. Okay. Think about it this way. The reason that this dollar is accepted is because the people taking it have confidence that they can then turn around and use this dollar on something else. Right? Right? Confidence. They're not going to take monopoly money. They're not going to take pesos. You know, they're not going to take whatever. You know, you can't just barter. I'm going to give you these bottle caps, and then you give me, you know, Coke or whatever. They have to have confidence that they can turn around and use this dollar. Once upon a time, though, the reason that people took the money had less to do with confidence. It was part to do with confidence, but also because dollars, paper currency, you used to be able to take dollars and exchange them for their equal value in gold or silver, bullion, okay? That was known as the gold standard because dollars were placeholders for real gold and silver, all right? It was seen as official currency that could be one day brought to a bank and exchanged for bullion. The reason that we don't have a gold standard anymore is because the gold standard, essentially, there's only so much gold on Earth's surface, right? It puts a bottle cap on the amount of dollars that can be produced. Otherwise, you produce too many of them, and you're not going to get any gold back because you'd be getting like, how much gold can you get for $1 these days? Think about that for a second. like a grain of sand's worth of gold, maybe, not much, all right? So you don't really want a gold standard because it effectively it puts a bottle cap on the amount of wealth that your nation can produce, all right? But back in this time, that was seen as the only way to guarantee the value of money, was the gold standard. So that's why Russia adopts the gold standard, is because they want to stabilize their currency to say, hey, this is backed by a certain amount of gold that you can go and exchange for, all right? Put my dollar over here. All right. So by 1900, Russia was fourth in steel production. They were behind the US, Germany, and Britain in steel production. By 1900, Russia was exporting half of the world's refined petroleum. Now, as in Western Europe, industrialization in Russia contributed very much to the spread of Marxist thought, because what happens in the early days of industrialization is that people's lives usually become kind of miserable for a while, right? Think about what happened in Britain when it first started industrializing. People start moving to urban areas, it starts getting really crowded, it starts getting really polluted, there's a lot of crime, and you also see a widening of the gap between the really, really, really wealthy people and the really, really, really poor people, okay? So in Russia, all of those same things happen when they first start industrializing. And when you see a group of people, like the working class, the proletariat, all right, urban workers and peasants, rural workers on farms, they start to feel very left out of this process of industrialization because none of that wealth is trickling down to them, right? They're instead working in, wage laboring conditions. Think about the conditions in factories in Britain when they first started industrializing. They were miserable, right? And so Marxism starts to become appealing to these folks because, of course, they feel like they've been disenfranchised, right? So they wanted to start transforming and creating a more revolutionary movement to change the government of Russia towards the start of the 20th century. So despite economic and social reforms, Russia's economic problems were still quite staggering by 1900. And this is when we get to Alexander III. Alexander III is what we would call a reactionary Tsar, okay? A reactionary Tsar. The last time we talked about reactionary conservatives, we were talking about the Congress of Vienna. Remember the Congress of Vienna that happened after Napoleon was defeated? They held a meeting. Clemens von Metternich was the leader of that meeting. He was a conservative, and he wanted to bring Europe back to a time before the French Revolution when kings were in power, absolutism was the norm, and all of that sort of stuff. Alexander III is going to be one of these reactionary Tsars, okay? His motto was autocracy, meaning the Tsar has total power, okay? Orthodoxy, meaning Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and Russification, which was creating a national spirit, a national identity in Russia. All right, that's his motto. He also, Alexander III, encouraged pogroms, anti-Semitism, okay? Remember that Russia, of all places in Europe at this time, were one of the most racist towards Jewish folks. They were extremely discriminatory and violent in persecuting Jews. In fact, the situation got so bad for Jewish people that many of them started migrating out of Russia, even coming as far over to the United States. See, Jews, mistakenly, got blamed for the assassination of Alexander II. And so a lot of Russian folks took out their anger, hostility, on Jewish folks, who made up only a small segment of the Russian population and were not viewed as Russian. Thousands of Jewish homes were destroyed, businesses were disrupted or destroyed as well, and many more Jews ended up being killed during pogroms of the early 20th century under the last Tsar of Russia. His name was Nicholas II. All right, so even more Jewish folks were killed under Nicholas II than under Alexander III before him. So let's talk a little bit about Nicholas II here. Nicholas II, you'll see here, reigned from 1894 to 1917. 1917 is a very important year in Russian history. Okay, 1917 is the year of the Russian Revolution, all right, which we are quickly approaching. We're not there yet, but we will be soon, all right? Give you a little background about what happened. Nicholas II is kind of a control freak, all right? He's a control freak. He is trying to run Russia in the start of the 20th century, the 1900s, okay, as though it's 1750, all right? But the problem is that it's not 1750. It's 1900. And that means that Europe is a lot different, by and large, than it was 150 years earlier. Think about it this way. Imagine if all of a sudden we had a president who was trying to run the country as though it was 1776, all right? That's going to not fit very well. You get me? All right? Nicholas II is essentially just way too controlling for his own good. He is unwilling in many cases to delegate tasks out to people. Instead, he tries to do everything himself. He essentially has this belief that the only person who can make a good decision for Russia is the Tsar. And since he's the Tsar, he leaves it to himself to be making basically every single decision that happens in Russia. Problem being, there's a billion, I don't know how many people were living in Russia at the time, but a lot, tens of millions, okay, living in Russia. You can't control every single last thing. Nicholas II is getting himself bogged down by all sorts of different crazy things. He's handling divorces, and he just overwhelms himself because he's completely unwilling to delegate tasks out to people. Meanwhile, Russia had run into problems. You might remember me mentioning on Monday, if you saw the lecture, that Russia had won a war against the Ottoman Empire. They had defeated the Ottoman Empire in a war in 1878. But after that war, Britain objected to that war, and there was a meeting in Berlin called the Congress of Berlin in 1878, which was negotiated by Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of the German Empire. And Russia walks away from that meeting, and despite the fact that they had defeated the Turks, they essentially get nothing out of that. So instead of continuing to focus on the Balkans, southeastern Europe, where they had been trying to go down and take over Constantinople and stuff like that, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, instead of continuing to focus their efforts in Europe, they switched their focus over to the far east of their nation, the Pacific. And so what ends up happening is that as they go over and they're building a railroad all the way across Russia, they're looking for a warm water port, okay? They're looking for a warm water port all the way over near Korea. As they are going through what is now North Korea, essentially, or the very southern part, well, it's actually northern China, but it's the border where China and North Korea is, okay? They go over, and they're trying to build a railroad that goes all the way over to a port there so that they'll have a warm water port to trade in the Pacific. When they go over there, they end up running into the Japanese. The Japanese had already taken over most of the Korean peninsula by this time. And so the Russians wage a war against Japan. It's called the Russo Japanese War. And it's very short. It only lasts a number of months, from 1904 to the start of 1905. Oddly enough, Japan was able to completely demolish Russia in this war. You might think, wow, well, Russia was already industrializing. They're fourth in the world in steel production. They've got this, long standing dynasty of the Tsars, and they've been around for a long time. How did the Japanese defeat the Russians? Well, the answer comes down to in the 1860s, Japan began industrializing. They industrialized, though, really, really fast. Basically, within about 45, 50 years, Japan has developed one of the most powerful navies on the planet. So the Russians, when they run into the Japanese, they go into it overconfident, thinking, what are the Japanese going to do? Plus, too, remember, everybody in Europe at this time is basically racist against anyone who isn't European. So they run into the Japanese, they're thinking to themselves, oh, well, this will be easy. We'll just defeat the Japanese and we'll continue doing what we want. Spoiler alert, that's not the way that it goes. And ultimately, Japan absolutely wallops the Russians in this conflict. And the Russians are forced to turn back, and once again, they have been defeated. And it's humiliating to Russia. They can't believe that they've lost this war against the Japanese. They were trying to establish this sphere of influence in northern China, and as you go over into Korea, this area known as Manchuria, northern China. And they were trying to extend that rule into northern Korea, but they faced this humiliating defeat. The Russian Navy is no match for the Japanese Navy, and there's this bloody war on land that it results in Russia turning away from Eastern Asia and once again refocusing their efforts back on the Balkans. So, this conflict, the Russo-Japanese War, I cannot understate how important it is in understanding why Nicholas II faces so much problems during his reign. The Russo-Japanese War was the first indicator that Russia was probably going to have a serious revolt. All right? After the Russo-Japanese War happens, there is rioting when Russia loses the war. There's rioting against Nicholas II. All right? People come out and they start protesting Nicholas II's rule as the Tsar of Russia. His response to this, rather than listening to these protesters and making changes, is to crack down on them. And this is where we get to the revolution of 1905. There had already been a number of problems in Russia. The Russo-Japanese War was, have you ever heard the phrase, the straw that broke the camel's back? You ever heard that before? Kids? The straw that broke the camel's back? Think about it this way. You got a camel. You're loading that camel up, putting all sorts of stuff on it. More and more and more and more weight. You keep adding more and more stuff. The camel is already overloaded, and you add that one last piece of straw, and that's the thing that breaks the camel's back. Okay? The Russo-Japanese War is that kind of situation. There had already been a heap of problems that Russia had. Okay? The Russo-Japanese War, Russia losing that war, was the thing that was the tipping point. Okay? They had a poor economy, all right? And the strain of that war led peasants and the middle class of Russia to start demanding reforms from Nicholas II. Fast forward to January of 1905, Bloody Sunday happens. What is Bloody Sunday? It's where 200,000 peasants and workers marched peacefully. They weren't even violently protesting. They marched peacefully to the Winter Palace asking for reforms from the Tsar. They're just trying to say, hey, listen to our grievances. We've got some problems here. We need them fixed. Rather than Tsar Nicholas II saying, I hear you, and here's what I'm going to do to change it, because obviously people want some changes made, he instead orders the military to fire into the crowd of protesters. And they end up killing hundreds of people peacefully protesting. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. Could you imagine peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. showing up at the Capitol building? They're not violent, they're not armed, they're just protesting, and then the president ordering the U.S. military to open fire on the crowd of protesters. Can you imagine? It would be the biggest news story of the century, okay? It would be huge. It would be horrible. But this is exactly what ended up happening in Russia in 1905. They call it Bloody Sunday. There's a strike, a general strike. Workers refuse to work. Peasants are revolting. Troops are mutinying because many of the troops are coming from the peasant class themselves. And it paralyzed Russia by October, and the Tsar finally says, all right, enough's enough. I'll make some changes. He makes some concessions. He basically says, look, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to create this body, this parliamentary body called the Duma, D-U-M-A. The Duma will be essentially like a parliament where people, representatives, are going to be able to come in and meet. They can discuss things. Whatever things they discuss, changes they come up with, they can present to me, and I'll make a final decision on whether or not they get approved. Okay? This is what he says. The Duma meets like twice, and he basically says, I'm not going to listen to these guys. So he makes these changes in order to get the strikes and the mutinies to stop. A mutiny is when the troops of a military start rioting and fighting against the officers of the military, the higher ranks. Okay? In order to get all that to stop, he makes these concessions. But ultimately, he ends up kind of just not going along with what he made. And this is, once again, another indicator that Tsar Nicholas II is just unwilling to really make changes. So the Duma, this assembly that was created that would serve as basically an advisory body to the Tsar. You know, they would provide advice to the Tsar about changes, complaints of the middle and lower classes. And in the Duma, there was freedom of speech, assembly, and press. But the Tsar ultimately retained ultimate veto power. So anything that the Duma came up with that he didn't like, he could veto it and say, nope, we're not doing that. Revolutionaries were divided. Not everybody had the same opinion in Russia in terms of their revolutionary spirit. So ultimately, the Duma has no real influence, and the Tsar basically stops listening to it as soon as it's created. And we see continuing problems because the propertied classes, the nobles and wealthy merchants, were able to gain more wealth at the expense of their workers, peasants, and various minorities. Now, Russia does experience a mild economic recovery between the years 1907 and 1914. Not really because of anything Nicholas II does, but just because things get a little bit better for a while. But when 1914 happens, that's also a key year in European history, not just for Russia, but for the entire continent of Europe. Because 1914 is the first year of World War I. Okay? When Russia gets involved in World War I, things go immediately right back downhill. Okay? They crash and burn. Russia's experience in World War I was absolutely miserable. It's so bad that the Russians end up having to drop out of World War I before the war is even over with. The troops refuse to continue to fight because they're losing people at a rate of 5-1 comparative to everyone else fighting in the war. In other words, for every one person that's killed in the war from, say, Germany or from Britain, 5 are being killed from Russia. So if you extend those numbers out, for every 1,000 that are killed, that's 5,000. For every 100,000 that are killed, that's 500,000 that are killed in Russia. All right? You can see how very quickly these numbers get out of control. By the time that Russia has to drop out of the war, they've lost 5 million people in World War I. 5 million. That number pales, though, in comparison to the number of people that Russia lost in World War II, which was closer to 25 million people, okay, in World War II. Russia's performance in World War I was so abysmally bad that the Tsar loses total control and has to step down. And in 1917, that's when they have a revolution that results in the complete overthrow of the Tsar, the complete overthrow of the Duma, and the establishment of communism in a place that Russia turns into called the Soviet Union, which we will talk about in a later class once we get to the Russian Revolution. But I'm just setting all of this up for you now so that you guys understand what's coming down the pike in just a little bit here. So that brings us to the end of this PowerPoint. We are not done with this unit yet. We still have to cover imperialism, which I haven't gotten to, but we will start on, let's see. I'll probably do, just so that we can continue making progress and get stuff done on time, I will probably be putting up a lecture on Friday relating to imperialism, but I'll start it this afternoon because that's what, we've already covered Russian Revolution for the morning here. I'll start imperialism this afternoon, but there will probably be more imperialism on Friday and another assignment associated with that. All right, guys? All right. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in, folks. And you guys have a wonderful day, and we'll see you back next week. All right. Take care. Yeah. Okay.